The station floated above a quiet blue world, turning slowly while its lights blinked across the metal hull. It was a place where many travelers passed through. Ships landed, ships left. Workers moved from one hall to the next with tired shoulders and empty eyes. Life here ran on routines. No one expected something surprising to happen. Yet this story began on a day that looked ordinary from every angle. A young worker stepped out of a supply shuttle wearing clothes worn thin from use. His name was Dan. He carried a small bag that held almost nothing. His steps were slow because he had not eaten a full meal in days. He came to the station with hope that he could find a simple job, something that would let him earn enough to live without fear of hunger. The station had a reputation for hiring people who were willing to do any task. Dan believed this was his chance. He walked through the main hall where vendors sold food behind bright counters. The air smelled of spices, fried dough, and strong broth. A long line of workers moved past each stall. Dan paused to look at the food. He felt embarrassed that he wanted to ask for help but knew he could not. No one here gave food for free. Everyone worked hard to get their share. A group of workers noticed him staring at a tray of hot bread. They glanced at each other and started to laugh. One of them said that he must think staring at food long enough could make it jump into his hands. Another said they should take a picture of him because he looked like a man who just realized he had no money. Dan lowered his gaze and stepped back. He did not want trouble. He only wanted a chance. When the group kept laughing, Dan tried to speak. He asked if anyone needed help with cleaning or loading boxes. He said he would work for one piece of bread. The group laughed louder. A tall worker leaned forward and asked what else he could do besides cleaning. Dan hesitated. His fingers moved as if touching something invisible. One worker asked if he played an instrument. Dan nodded. He said he could play a piano. The tall worker slapped the counter and told his friends that they had found a musician who worked for crumbs. They told Dan there was an old piano in the rest hall, but half the keys did not work. They said the sound was so bad that even the cleaning bots refused to go near it. Dan said he could try. The group liked this answer. They grabbed small snacks and said they would give him a piece of bread if he played one full tune. They said it in a joking tone because they thought he would fail. Dan followed them to the rest hall. The room was wide with long tables and metal benches. A dull piano stood in one corner. The varnish was chipped and the keys were yellow. Dust gathered around the legs. The tall worker told Dan to sit and play something good. He said if Dan played well they would give him bread. If he played poorly they would give him nothing. Dan nodded again. Dan sat on the bench and rested his fingers on the keys. He did not begin right away. He closed his eyes. His body relaxed. His breathing slowed to a steady rhythm. Then he pressed the first key. The sound surprised everyone. It was not harsh. It was soft. It echoed through the room in a way that filled the silence with warmth. Then Dan played another note. Then another. His hands started to move with confidence. The workers who laughed earlier went silent. They watched his hands glide across the keys. The broken piano seemed alive again, as if it had been waiting for someone to unlock its voice. Dan did not rush. Every note came out with intention. Every shift in melody felt careful and strong. He played a tune that sounded like a memory of home. It was gentle at the start. Then it grew into something full of emotion. It carried sadness, hope, hunger, strength. The room stood still. More workers entered the hall. They came for lunch but stopped when they heard the music. Some leaned against the walls. Some sat down without speaking. A small group of travelers passing through the station also came in. They looked surprised to see a crowd staring at an old piano. When Dan continued to play, the tune reached every corner of the hall. People felt something rise inside them that they could not explain. The tall worker who made fun of Dan looked ashamed. He realized Dan was not begging out of laziness. He was trying to survive. The music carried truth more powerful than words. When Dan finished the last note, his fingers hovered above the keys. The hall stayed silent for a few long seconds. Then everyone in the room clapped. Some stood and clapped louder. Others cheered. Dan looked down, not sure what to do. He had never played for a crowd this big. He did not know how to respond to praise. The tall worker stepped forward and placed 2 pieces of bread in Dan's hands. He said Dan deserved more than this and apologized for laughing. The group that mocked him earlier also apologized. Dan accepted the bread with gratitude. He ate 1 piece and saved the other for later. He did not expect what happened next. A station officer walked into the room with calm steps. She had heard the music through the hall speakers. She asked who played the piano. Everyone pointed at Dan. The officer asked Dan if he had any formal training. He shook his head. He never attended a proper music school. Everything he knew came from an old upright piano in a shelter back home. The officer nodded and asked if he wanted a stable job on the station. Dan stared at her in disbelief. She explained that the station often welcomed visitors from distant worlds. Some of these visitors enjoyed cultural events. The station used to have a small performance program where human artists shared music or stories. The program shut down when funding decreased. But if someone like Dan joined, they could resume it again. They only needed someone with genuine talent. She said the performance program paid well enough for Dan to live without fear of hunger. Dan accepted with a quiet yes. The officer told him to come to her office the next morning to sign forms. Word spread quickly through the station. Workers from many departments talked about the young man who played the old piano. Some said he made the piano sound new. Others said the music carried something that touched every listener. They all agreed he had talent. That night Dan slept in a small rest pod. He held the second piece of bread and ate it slowly. He felt warm inside not only because of the food, but also because someone believed in him. He thought of the piano. He thought of the music still echoing in the rest hall. He did not know what the future held, but he knew it would be different from the past. The next day Dan met the officer and signed the forms. She led him to a clean room in the cultural wing. Inside stood a new digital piano with perfect sound. Dan placed his hands on the keys and felt tears in his eyes. He played a short melody. The officer smiled. She told him their first event would be in a few days. Dan practiced every hour with dedication. He wanted to give the best performance he could. When the event day arrived, the hall filled with workers and visitors. Lights dimmed. Dan sat at the piano wearing a simple clean uniform. The officer introduced him and said the program would start again thanks to him. Then Dan began to play. This time the sound carried across a hall with good acoustics. The melody lifted people's hearts. Visitors from other worlds listened with calm expressions. Some closed their eyes. Some recorded the moment on small devices. By the end of the performance, the hall filled with applause. Dan stood and bowed. He felt the same calm warmth he felt when he first played the old piano, but stronger. He knew this was no longer a small moment. This was the start of a new path. Weeks passed. Dan performed several times a month. Each show brought new people. The station became known as a place where travelers could hear human music played with skill and emotion. Some visitors told their leaders about the program. Before long, officials from distant worlds arrived to watch Dan play. They respected humans for many things but rarely spoke of human art. Yet Dan changed their view. His music showed them that humans held great depth in their hearts. The station upgraded the cultural hall. They added soft lighting and better speakers. They added seats with cushions. They even repaired the old piano in the rest hall so workers could play if they wanted. The officer told Dan that the station council planned to sponsor him for a tour across nearby colonies. His music could represent human spirit. Dan could hardly believe it. He came to the station with an empty stomach and almost no money. Now he played for crowds that listened with admiration. Sometimes he remembered the day he arrived. He remembered the laughter, the hunger, the moment he touched the old piano. All of it felt unreal, yet he carried no bitterness. He knew those moments shaped the path to where he stood now. One afternoon, the tall worker who mocked him the first day came to the cultural hall. He stood awkwardly with a small package in his hands. Dan greeted him with a friendly smile. The worker said he wanted to thank him for bringing life to the station. He said the music made long days feel shorter. He also said he was sorry again. Dan accepted the gift and shook his hand. Inside the package was a small wooden cane shaped like a piano. As the months passed, Dan's name became known on several stations. People repeated the story of the hungry worker who traded music for food, but turned out to be a prodigy. Some added small details that changed from one telling to another, but the core remained the same. A human with skill hidden behind humble clothes played music that touched countless hearts. Dan never let pride take over. He kept his practice schedule. He played daily. He helped young workers who wished to learn. He repaired old practice instruments and gave them to children. He shared his story when someone felt hopeless. He told them that talent meant nothing without effort and effort meant nothing without hope. Through all this, humanity gained a new reputation among distant worlds. For years, many cultures admired human technology or human courage in battle. Now they also admired human art. They saw humans as a species with deep emotion and strong creative spirit. Dan became a small but important symbol of that image. One day the officer told Dan that a council from another system invited him to perform at a festival. It was an event where many species shared their expressions of culture. Dan agreed with excitement. He traveled with a small crew to the festival world. The hall there was massive with seating for thousands. When Dan stepped onto the stage, he saw faces from many worlds. Some had bright skin. Some had tall frames. Some had soft glowing eyes. All of them waited in silence. Dan sat at the piano placed in the center of the stage. He touched the keys. He took a deep breath. Then he began to play. The melody he chose was one he wrote himself. It was inspired by his first day on the station. It began with soft tones like a quiet hall. Then it grew into something warm like shared bread. After that it rose into a strong wave like the applause he heard that day. By the end the hall vibrated with sound. The crowd rose to its feet. Applause filled the hall. Dan stood and bowed. His heart felt full. He knew at that moment that his journey had changed not only his life, but also the view others held of his people. Through one simple tune, he showed the strength of human spirit. When the festival ended, Dan walked outside into the cool air. He looked at the stars above. He remembered the boy he once was, hungry, quiet, carrying nothing but hope. Now he carried music that reached across worlds. He smiled and felt grateful. Humanity had many stories. Some were filled with courage. Some were filled with discovery. Some were filled with conflict. But Dan's story was different. It showed that greatness could rise from small moments. It showed that even a simple tune could open hearts. It showed that humans held something deep and powerful inside, something that no one could measure. He walked back into the hall for one final encore. He sat at the piano with calm confidence. He touched the keys. He played one last gentle tune. And the galaxy listened.